Thank you for coming to the talk, which is called Dotting the Ethics I's and Crossing the T's. Solid Ethics for Free Open Source Software User Research. So my name is Bernard Tyers. I'm a user researcher and interaction designer. And this talk isn't about designing things, or isn't about sketching or prototypes. This is about what's often the invisible work that can often be overlooked because it's too hard to do or because it's confusing for people. This is about doing user research ethically with your users. So, a little pop quiz. Who knows what user research? And if the answer is I don't know, that's okay. So put your hands up. If you don't worry. Okay, super. So user research is part of the user-centered design process where you research, you find out about your users, what they need to do, who they are, what they do, why they do it like that. Then you design something. Your first prototype, your actual software, and then you test it, and you build it. And then you go around in this wonderful iteration. User research is about, as the lady this morning said, it's important to understand how people think and how they behave, particularly when you're building software for them. Why is it important? Well, it's important to understand your community, your users, to inform the design and development of the software that you're building. And you're building this software, not always, but often, to help people achieve goals and solve problems for them. You can build a software without understanding the users and without doing research, but often, not always, but often, it's not going to end up being the right kind of software for them. So I'm talking about ethics today. So this isn't my definition. Ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So in this case, the activity is user research. And I'm going to talk about things that you really should think about and try to put in place. And I'm going to give examples of where I've done this in the past when doing your user research. Okay? So, rule 0 of user research, do no harm. In this case, do no harm to your users. These people are giving you their time, they're speaking honestly, they're opening up their lives, their houses, their work, for the sole purpose for you to understand what they do, how they do it, to gather information in order to design that software better that will more than likely affect them. You could look on this interaction as purely transactional. You give me your time and information, and then I try and give you better software. That's quite a shallow way of looking at it, purely transactional, because in this interaction there's a power imbalance. I'm the researcher, I'm the designer, the UX designer, and you are the participant, and I'm in control. You're my test subject, I prod you, and you jump, or you tell me, what it is I want to hear. And that's not how it should be. Okay? So I'm going to go through some principles that you should try to, take into account and try and put in practice when you're doing user-centered design, and specifically user research. So you should ensure that your participants suffer no adverse consequences, physiological, psychological, social, or political, or economic, as a result of taking part. This explains the do no harm. So you might say, well, how can somebody suffer physiological, psychological, social harm by just telling me how they use my software and what they do? So I'll give you an example. I was working on a project, not an open source project, but a project in an Arabic country where the predominant religion was Muslim. And we were recruiting people to come in to talk to us and conduct tests of our software, seeing does it work for them, how does it work, where does it not work, what's confusing, all of those different tasks like Renata spoke about this morning. So this person came in to carry out, to do research. Our research objective was to test a particular part of the software, and we wanted to understand how would they use it. So we were also recording the session, the person's face, their voice, and everything that was going on in the room with their consent. So during our interview, one of my questions was, so why do you travel so often? This was one of the prerequisites for people coming in to do research. And the participant who was male told us that they were visiting their partner in London, who was also male. Now, this isn't any way of interest to our research, but this person, because they were being open, told us all of the story. And in fact, they went into even more of the detail that we didn't need to hear. So the sex of our participant was not relevant, or of, or of their partner was anyway relevant to our research. If this was in a different country, you'd say, well, who cares? And you'd be right. Why? But in this particular situation, in this particular country, I was worried both for my outcome and also for the participants if we were stopped, as we could have been, in the airport going back to the UK, and a security person saying, can I see what's on your laptop? So I would have had, video and audio evidence of this particular person saying that they were homosexual, which was of no importance. So what I had to try and do during my research session was, without freaking the person out, allowing them to continue because they felt this was of importance. Then I stopped the recording. We carried on, and we carried on doing our session. And at the end, I deleted the recording, so no evidence of the research. That's one very small example of how somebody could have, negative impacts as a result of telling you things. If you're working in security or privacy, you can imagine even more situations. So humans have human rights, surprise, surprise, in real life, on their daily, on the street, in their daily lives. They also have rights when they're taking part in your research. Okay, so these rights are the right not to participate, the right to withdraw, the right to give informed consent, to anonymity, and to confidentiality. So I'm going to go through each of these and go into a little bit more detail and give examples where possible. So the right to not participate. If someone doesn't want to participate in your research, then they don't have to. You should accept their decision. You may recruit somebody who's interested in taking part at the beginning, and you explain to them what you want to do, and they're interested. And they might change their mind later on. You cannot make this person be involved in your research. This problem often arises when you're doing research with internal users or staff members. They're told by their boss, okay, you've got to be involved in this because, yeah, we need to make this thing better, and so on, so on. People then feel that they have to be positive about the software being tested, and this is not the case. We want honest, critical feedback. It's a pain in the ass for the UX designer or user researcher because you need to carry out your research, but that's your problem, not theirs. You're the professional. They're just the human. The right to withdraw. So even if someone initially agrees to take part, they can change their minds at any time. I had a participant coming into a user research session where I went through the purpose of the research. I explained what we were going to do, how we were going to do it. They even agreed to everything as I was explaining it. And then 3 or 4 minutes after the first question, they just kind of, clammed up and said, no, I'm not doing this. And I asked why he didn't want to take part, to see if I could maybe, make him feel a bit more comfortable and explain, no, that's not the case. But he just said, no, I'm not interested. So at that point, I thanked him and said, okay, well, thank you for coming in. Here's the incentive that we were going to give you anyway, if you completed the research or not. And he left. So to this day, I still don't know why he changed his mind. I have my thoughts, but I couldn't ask him because he wasn't willing to tell me. So the right to informed consent. So this is often misunderstood as being very complicated, and depending on what you're researching and depending who you're researching it with, it can be complicated, but it can also be quite simple. Informed consent essentially means before you can take as given that the person consents, gives their permission to take part in your research, they can only really give that consent when they understand exactly what it is they're being part of, what they're taking part of. So if you say, hey, come along and test our app we're building, we want to see how it works for you, that description doesn't give the person very much understanding of what's actually involved. And if that's all you're doing, then sure, that's fine. When the person is actually in the user research session and you now tell them, so what we're working on is, a password manager, and we want to see your passwords to see what kind of format you use, and, we want to see where you store them, and what websites you use, and do you change passwords across websites? That can also depend if you're dealing with, I don't know, an investigative journalist who's working in a very difficult environment. That could actually, put them at danger. So that's much different. The person may have consented to take part in your research based on what you told them at the beginning, but now the situation is much, much different. So, they can only, as I said, give informed consent once they understand what's happening. So as I said, it can sometimes be difficult to get informed consent. A real-world example, if you're working on anti-phishing mechanism in an email client, you can't really recruit participants and say, okay, so we're going to be doing research on this anti-phishing feature in our email. We want to see if you'll fall for this phishing email. That's not really going to work because you're giving them the full objective and you're giving exactly what you're testing. So in a situation like this, you could flip it around and say, okay, we're going to be testing our email client and, to see how it works, et cetera, et cetera. You could give them the example of, here's an email, and then ask them how they respond, whatever exactly you're looking to test. They do that test. At the end, you can say, okay, so we recruited you for testing our email client. We didn't tell you everything. What we were testing was this particular anti-phishing technique. That's fine. What you then have to do is, because somebody could say, well, now I don't trust any email I get. I don't know if I'm being phished. What you then have to try and do is provide them with a little bit of support, a little bit of, sort of aftercare, and say, okay, here's why we were doing it. Here's what we were doing. Potentially give them access to a psychologist or a therapist. In that case, it's probably not needed, but you have to provide them with aftercare to make sure that there is no harm. Yeah. So another real-world example. This wasn't an open source project. This was a service to help compulsive online gamblers. So my research was focused very, very much on designing this software, a web service, in order to understand online gambling and the various different thought processes they have. I needed to speak with them. So I recruited a number of online gamblers. I explained what we would do. I explained how I would do it. They gave me their informed consent. However, during our discussions, we strayed into the very negative effects that participants had from gambling, suicide attempts, drug and alcohol abuse. I had people breaking down and crying. I'm not a psychologist. That's not my expertise. And even though I had said to them at the very beginning, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to be able to help you. We're staying away from that. This is what happens when you do research with people. You give them a very clear path and they stray off. And you need to kind of politely, bring them back on. So at the end of the research, I said, okay, we could have brought up some very difficult topics for you. Here's the information of a gambling support organization who will help you. And that's as much as I could do. I couldn't make them go to the support because it wasn't my position to. So informed consent should really be gotten in written format. This is to make sure that the participant has actually understood what you're researching and that they've read through everything and you have some documentary evidence. That's not always possible, though, particularly in remote research. So here's an example of an academic research where the researcher is required by the university to get written consent. So the participant has to initial each one of these things to say, I agree, I understand, for each of these different points. This is quite a long form, but it has to be due to the extremely high level of ethical behavior that's required by this academic research. Here's my consent form that I've put together, a template for when I do work in open source projects. It's broken down into 2 sections, and it is, I think, GDPR compliant in terms of what it is I want to gather. So if it's written notes, audio notes, video notes, photos, yes and no. And then at the end, who do you agree these recordings can be viewed by? So either it's just me, the researcher, maybe the team that's working on the thing. It could be everybody in the world, put it on the internet so that everybody can see it. And this, again, gives the participant, the authority, the control to say, I'll allow you this, but not this. This is not difficult to do. Most people, understand what you're doing. Once you have a reasonably simple template, you can just use it over and over again. And at the end, they sign. So if you're doing research remotely, via telephone, web conference, something like that, it's not possible to get written consent. So depending on if it's acceptable or not, there's nothing wrong with asking the people for verbal consent. So verbal consent, here's my sort of telephone consent form where essentially I explain the exact same thing. So who I am, what I'm doing, who I'm doing it for, why I'm doing it, how long it will take, etc., etc. And then I ask them, can I record? If they say yes, wonderful. If they say no, that's also fine. Then you explain what you're going to happen. You ask again once more for permission to record because you've now got the recording button pressed and you now have the record of them saying, yes, I can record. If they stop, if they say no, you stop the recording. You can continue. Do you need consent to carry out research? Not necessarily. Only if you're going to be making some, permanent notes, permanent records of something that can be tied back to that person. Some people see this as being long-winded and it's a lot of work, and well, that's tough luck. That's your profession. That's part of your job, your contribution to the project. So, anonymity. Participants have the right to anonymity. They have the right to their identity and location to be protected. You don't have to record their name. You don't have to record their address, their date of birth, their shoe size, exactly how long they've been doing whatever. This level of personal information can often actually be unimportant in research. What you're looking for is commonalities across people or across groups. Okay, so instead of that, you can give them a pseudonym. So it can be a really boring pseudonym like, participant 1, or it can be, what I do is I try and make it more meaningful, so Jack or, curly hairs. it makes it relevant to me. I remember that person, as long as it makes sense to you. When you're sharing the research, all you need to share is the pseudonym. Often people will say, well, I'd like to follow up with that person to ask them some more questions, which is sort of code word for what the hell were they doing? How could they not see why this was so easy to use? And you might need to say, well, if you have any questions, come via me. We can send them for you. If the person doesn't want to be anonymous, then that's fine. That's also okay. So I'd like to give you a few examples of some research from a project I was doing some contributions for. SecureDrop. Has anybody heard of SecureDrop? If you haven't, that's okay. A few people have. Most people haven't. Okay. So SecureDrop is essentially an open source project which is used by journalists and news organizations to communicate anonymously, securely with whistleblowers. So if I had something to release to a newspaper, I would use their SecureDrop instance and I would send those files, and there's no way of tying those back to me. So I was doing some research with internal users of SecureDrop, so journalists, sysadmins, InfoSec, people within news organizations. I was interviewing them, transcribing those interviews, and then providing them, sharing them with the project. So here's what I shared with the project. Participant 3 joined NewsOrg 3 as an information security engineer less than 5 years ago. Before that, they worked at an e-commerce company. They worked in IT for over 15 years and made their way into InfoSec via IT. Nobody needed to know the person's name, who they worked for, exactly where they came from, because that wasn't relevant. So, confidentiality. Participants have the right that the data you obtain from them is kept confidential. So, again, depending on what you're researching, depending on what you're designing, depending on what you're developing, you might not need the information to be confidential, or it might be critical. So, GDPR is GDPR. You can be in quite a difficult situation because you're asking people all of this information. You're handling all of this, potentially private information, and it can be quite a big overhead. So my kind of personal rule of thumb is don't hold any personal information unless it's necessary. So if I haven't got it, I can't lose it. And that's it. So if you're going to store that information, store it securely, so at least on an encrypted device, drive, something like that, offline, and then destroy the data in line with your research guidelines. So I'll explain research guidelines later on. So what's the whole purpose of all this? I mean, you could just do it without doing any of those previous things. And the whole purpose of this is to establish trust with your users. So if you're part of a community and you know them and they're familiar with you and you're familiar with them, you probably already have that trust. Whereas for me, going into the SecureDrop community originally, I knew nobody. I knew one or two of the contributors, but that was it. So the whole purpose of this is communicating to the research participants that they're in control. It's to try and flip this, perceived incorrect assumption that you're the researcher or the developer, you're in charge. In fact, it's the opposite. The user researcher or designer is there to guide the participant and keep the session on topic. Establishing that trust with participants is important because it allows you to uncover those real issues and those actual real usability problems. So again, an example from the SecureDrop community, I had I'd done previous work with investigative journalists. I knew some of them. I had a certain trust relationship with them. What I was asking them to do was basically open their whole SecureDrop workflow, which, for those who are familiar with it, it's incredibly secret and incredibly important to keep it operationally secure, because depending on the organization, you could be receiving quite serious, quite critical information leaks. So based on the previous connections, I was able to make trusted communications with those journalists. And through that, I was able to document the whole process that they followed in detail, uncover their hacks, uncover their frustrations, uncover the ways that they were using it incorrectly and making them insecure, provided that back to the SecureDrop community. And their first reaction was, this is the first time we've actually seen this documented in this level. Oh my God, we've made these people's lives so hard. We're really sorry for this. They were working from the assumption of security is important for everybody. If they're not secure, they're going to be hacked by the NSA, or they're going to be screwed. Whereas in fact, what they had done was made people's lives quite insecure, but because they were making workarounds for all of these really overly complicated processes. So I understood the communities, I understood investigative journalists, and eventually SecureDrop. So I understood their reluctance to talk about their workflows and talk about their private, secure ways of working. So during the recruitment phase for the participants, I contacted news organizations by emails. I made it very clear what I was doing. I made it very clear how I was going to do it. And the line that's highlighted, it's a little bit fuzzy. So what happens after the interview? A transcript of the conversation will be sent to you to approve, even before it's shared with the SecureDrop team. You will also get to decide if it is published for everyone to see, or if it is only shared amongst the people participating in the SecureDrop UX team. So there was a potential for me having done 4 or 5 hours work to do this interview, transcribe this interview, send it back to them, and they to say, no, I'm not interested, I'm not allowing you send it. But that showed that they were in control. And out of all of those interviews, none of them said, you can't use it. We also put together a user research confidentiality agreement, which was in lieu for an NDA type thing. So again, we explained what we were doing, how we were doing it. To sum up, we will regard everything you tell us as confidential. We will send you the audio recording and its checksum. We ask you to authorize the transcript or redact as you see fit. We will then delete the audio recording. So that person had the original audio recording, and after that, everything was deleted. And then we went into more detail, again, explaining how we were going to do things. Again, it seems like laborious. This only took, I don't know, a few days in the end. And once we had it, this is how we did research from then on. Based on that, Belen put together some user research guidelines. Again, this is how we do research, making it very clear, making it very open, very transparent. If anybody said, I don't like that, we might have had a conversation and maybe tried to change it. Again, the whole purpose was to put the participant in control. They were the people who had the gold, and I was the guy with the, the pickaxe trying to get at this gold, but I couldn't make them. So there was about 9 or 10, 14 in fact, guideline steps. So why bother with all this? Why not just, get what you want and quit? So, I mean, you could do that, but you wouldn't have got to the level of detail, the actual level of the real problems that you were trying to get. So this was a quote from one of the participants. So, well, phrased as in third person. So she poses a good question when discussing SecureDrop submissions coming into a shared inbox. How do you effectively divide that up? And how do you do it in a way that's not biased and not one person going to choose the best stories? So to these journalists and to these internal people, this was a workflow system. This is a case management system. This wasn't email. Certain people needed to get certain things. However, the SecureDrop team were seeing this as uber security, zero, everything needed to be encrypted and encrypted in volumes, encrypted and separated and hygiene. And the journalists were saying, we can't do our work with this, so we have to put scaffolding on, make hacks, put stuff on an encrypted Google Drive, because the tool didn't do it for them. So slowly but surely, the SecureDrop team saw this and went, okay, well, actually, in that case, we need to work on the hard bit. The easy bit was putting all of the encryption together and putting all of the really cool things together, but it wasn't solving the user's problem. The purpose of this research was to inform the design of the software. And software, as you know much more than I do, is not start and finish. It's all over the place roller coaster ride of getting things wrong, getting things right. That's my talk. I've got, I think, 17 minutes. There's links to some of the things if you're interested in using those guidelines, using the consent forms, you're more than welcome. So thank you. That was probably a really serious sort of topic to go through. It wasn't all supposed to be, complicated and scary and, oh, this is way too hard. It was just to show that, the whole point of doing the research is, engaging with the users and doing it in a way that shows they're in control. It's not you. You're the documenter of their lives. And if they are willing to be honest and open with you, you can actually get to the real, yes, but why, and get down to the bottom of that problem. So if you have got any questions, I'm happy to answer. Or if you think, that's all rubbish, we don't need to do that. Or actually, yes, we've done that in our project and it's been really helpful. I'd like to hear from you as well. Yes?
So I came just a second. So I came to this talk because I've been interested in the topic of ethics in open source for a little while. Mm-hmm. Some of you know that I started an organization called InnerSource Commons, and one of the people that's involved in that is Theo Schlossnagel, who's an ex-Apache member. I think he might be emeritus now. But he is leading the charge at ACM from the board.
Yes.
To get people interested in an ethics pledge as well. And so InnerSource Commons is meant to teach the Apache way inside of companies. That's what we're trying to do. But one of the things that's interesting is we seem to be collecting municipalities that are interested in learning open source, and InnerSource is like the gateway drug, right? And we're really wanting there to be some kind of ethics pledge for people that show up there, because it's people's governance, it's people's lives. And there's been some bad ethics lately around elections and tech, right? But that's not what you were commenting on. You were talking more about the mechanics of disclosure, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that happens to Apache projects, famously to the Open Office project, is regular users show up and they don't really understand what an open source community is. And then they get upset when their comments, which are clueless, are public, which they typed into some public email form somewhere. What do you think Apache could do better to be a little clearer for the clueless?
Wow, okay. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that. When you say clueless, the users or the contributors? Maybe both. I mean, so I'm not a psychologist or anything from sort of the humanities. I'm from like an engineering background. I studied electronic engineering, went back to university, studied HCI. I'm continuously learning, you know, oh, so that's why you should do things like this. To me, sort of trying to act ethically, it should be part of, you know, everyday common human interactions. I've been put in situations in work projects, particularly in government, where I've eventually come across the reason why this thing might be happening, and I'm like, okay, this isn't good. What can I do? I can either, well, I can deal with this in a number of different ways, but you have to. You know, I mean, like the lady this morning said, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. You know, I've met some incredibly ethical, incredibly, you know, hard-thinking engineers who think very long and hard about the impacts of the work they do. It doesn't always make your life easier, but I think it makes you at least be able to say, well, I tried my best. So I think what can Apache do? I suppose promote, you know, that. Promote that, you know, think about the impact of your work. You're not going to know all of the impact. I read the ACM Code of Ethics, and I thought, hey, you know, that's actually pretty sensible, pretty straightforward. I'm amazed every month or every quarter, whatever it is, in the CACM magazine, where they're talking about, you know, ethics and doing things right. I personally find it wonderful to hear that. I never learned anything about ethics when I was studying electronic engineering. I think promoting, you know, that type of education to engineers, you know, I firmly believe that, you know, people don't want to be bad. Well, you know, people don't necessarily actively want to do bad things. You know, it can be circumstances, you know. But if you at least try to act in the right way, you know, that kind of larger movement can move things. Yeah. Thank you for a very difficult question.
I have an easier one.
Oh, thank God.
And it's the same thing I asked Kati before. So these can be quite overwhelming. So it might mean that you need to learn how to put together a consent form or how to gather consent without a form. It might mean that you need to come together with some kind of practices and policies when keeping research raw data and storing recordings or transcripts and things like that. It's quite a lot to do. Are there any good resources out there that provide sample documents or sample policies that free and open source projects can follow?
I think there are some good books. It depends on what it is. If it's something like doing usability testing, there's a great book, super thin, super easy to read, you know, by a guy, Steve Krug. I'm going to say the wrong name. It's either Rocket Surgery Made Easy. Yes, yeah, Rocket Surgery Made Easy, which is very, you know, simple mechanics of how to do usability testing. And while he doesn't go into gathering consent in depth, it's, you know, the book is written sort of from the point of view of doing things in the right way. I can add some more resources to that link on top, and I'll put some resources in the open source design resources repo. But it's not that difficult, you know. It takes a little bit of time, a little bit of thinking, and, you know, what would you like, or how would you like someone to treat you if you were in their situation? You know, that's have a bit of empathy with your user. Any other questions? I'm getting off easy, I think. No? Who here works on Apache, or who contributes to an Apache project? Okay, 2, 3, 4, okay. That is a good number of people. Do you know if you do user research, if you talk to users, if you see how they work, you know, visit them maybe, watch them doing things with the software? Mailing list. Okay. 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 Well, they're also users. They're humans too. Indeed. Well, everybody's special. Do you think that it would be difficult to put in place some of these, you know, slightly, you know, lower, easier guidelines? So let me see if I was to go back here to some of these. Any of these? No? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Respecting privacy, for example, by anonymizing data and expressing in advance the agreement of the dialogue. So setting the rules up front. Mm-hmm. It's very similar to how an open source community works. It's saying, okay, you're going to contribute this, which is your experience, mm-hmm. And your thoughts for the questions that we have. And this is how we're going to use this data, and also the privacy part. So in my experience, it goes very well. Mm.
Right, I would think I would agree with that, absolutely. Yeah.
The gaming development, I observed interesting thing, the Let's Plays on YouTube. When you watch them, you see that different people use the same game in very, very different ways. Maybe Minecraft, it's completely different, and but you can watch it because they, you can passively watch it because they put it on YouTube by themselves, and you could do research on that, or could, as a developer, see how people act differently on it. Are there some ways to passively watch people in the Apache world? They are not so keen on showing their daily work. Or
that's
about it.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I mean, yes, there are a number of different research methods you can use. Again, of course, all after the fact that the person has given consent for taking part in your research. Things like diary studies, you know, where people either write down in text. So I was doing this today, blah 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 blah. I tried to do this with this software, so on and so on. It didn't work. To rich media with videos, photos, actually them documenting their lives. I've seen some projects where they've given people like little cameras, and it will take a photo once every 10 seconds, every 30 seconds. So you get this, quite long sort of stopgap. Time stop, whatever the word is. Video. The participant then comes in, and the researcher will sit down and go, okay, so tell me about this day. Tell me about what was happening. In terms of the developer or the researcher passively watching while they're going about their day, I'm not so sure. I've certainly not come across anything like that.
Not existing, and so you don't have to think about ethics, about how to ask about consent. You're using it for research because it just doesn't exist.
I don't know. I think that would be quite difficult. Again, often because research, what you're also trying to sort of enable is the person to forget that this is a test or you're testing something. However, if you're observing a person's day from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m., you're observing their whole day. They could be doing things that they've forgotten. Actually, that brings up a good example. I remember being at a talk and somebody was. Thank you for your question. Somebody was talking about a project they were working on where it was some sort of, yes, they were measuring collaboration or something, or they were, measuring collaboration, or sort of, how colleagues will, move around and talk to each other. So the participants were employees of the company. They installed this application on their phone and it measured Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, proximity to other people who also had that application installed. And the purpose of it was to say, well, the people in this department are working quite closely with these people. So this ran for, 6 months, 2 months, whatever it was. And they were looking at the data and there's, okay, this is all very useful. And then they said, this participant and this participant seem to be in the same vicinity at 3 o'clock in the morning. What's going on here? So they started to sort of see, maybe it's a bug or maybe it's something that's not, working right. And they found that these two participants were meeting up very often in the same location, which kind of looked like a hotel when you put it on a map. These people had no knowledge or didn't know that this was happening. So a good example of people completely forgetting, data being gathered for one really good, understandable reason with their consent, but it had sort of leaked some other personal activity. So it can be really tricky. Yeah. Okay, I think that's everything. Thank you very much for your time and staying awake.